So some of the real-time assessments that I've incorporated are my note-taking, my anecdotal notes that I take when I walk around with my students. I have my list separated kind of in 3 ways. The first way is my students that I usually go to first in language. They're just my lower readers or developing and reading, and so I usually go to them directly and make sure, or if they just need more assistance, I know who those students are. So I have them actually boxed on my paper. I have their numbers highlighted in pink because that's based on my Galileo results that we did in quarter 3. For the first grade standard on quarter 3 when they compared text, I had 96% of them pass it. So that's why I moved to the second grade standard of focusing more on specific details based on survival of the octopus. They needed that next step. Okay, so those students who actually may have missed some of the questions on Galileo, I've highlighted them so I can specifically refer to them to make sure they still are on the right track. Aside from that, I think their discussions is definitely my real-time assessments because especially when they do the partner work and things like that and the we do, I want to make sure that I'm taking notes of those students and who's able to follow along with the steps. My observations as well, which is kind of like the discussions, and then my guiding questions throughout the lesson. I've created specific guiding questions for subgroups for certain students, so that is definitely going to help me see if they are staying on track with the lesson.
You spoke to your real-time assessments and shared that you would be observing during partner talk, using your anecdotal notes, really listening to their discussions.
Mm-hmm.
When you were listening to their discussions, you mentioned that you'd be listening to see if they were correctly using the steps. What other things are you sort of assessing on your checklist when you are listening to those discussions or any other part of the lesson?
Definitely. Obviously the discussion is very important, but I want to make sure that they're actually not just discussing it, but making sure when I walk over, I want to hear them say things like, oh, well, this detail is the same as this detail, so that tells me that these are the same from the text. I need to put that in the middle of my double bubble map, and I need to see them place that there. Or they say, well, now that we're done with the similarities, I'm hoping they, from my modeling, they'll say, these are our differences now. Let's put them on the outside because this came from Article 1, this came from Article 2. So not just the discussing, but I want to see them actually placing it and agreeing with their partner and feeding off each other's ideas and then applying it to the double bubble map.
Great. Now, what are you using to serve as your end of lesson assessment? And then with that, have you decided what is the level of mastery that you're expecting from your students?
Sure. I definitely am going to look at their double bubble map. That's the main part of their assessment that I want to make sure, because my main focus is that they are able to compare and contrast those important details. One thing I really want to focus on is in both groups, developing and advanced, but I want to make sure those inferred details, I want to see whether they put them separately or whether they put them together. And if I'm hoping that they do realize those and put them together if they're the same and keep the differences separate. But also their paragraph that they write from their text is going to be a good tool for me to see, are they actually not just putting it down their double bubble map, but actually understanding the connections and what was the same and what was different between the texts that they read.
Got it. So are you using a rubric or anything to score those double bubble maps or the writing itself?
Usually when I do the double bubble map, it's just on like a point system for how many actual bubbles that they have based on the categories and their details. And so they'll get a certain amount of points. For the paragraph, they have checklists that they use, like writer's checklists, and they know topic sentence, the details, the closing, transition words. That's a given that we practice a lot in class, and they know those are my expectations for them, and that I look for those things from their checklist.
Got it. So you have the checklist. How many points are you anticipating that you would consider mastery for the double bubble map?
When I have done the double bubble map before, it's usually at about like 30 points.
Okay.
Before an assessment. Most of my assessments, I make at least 30 points.
Okay. So are you anticipating at least a certain percentage?
So I would divide that up based on points from their bubbles and go from there and see how many points they got out of the 30 and then take the percentage from there. Yeah.
So commonly do you define mastery as like an 80%? Or as a school, I know maybe even sometimes you have an expectation, or is it 90%, or what is that?
I would say at least 90%.
90%.
Yeah. Definitely. And what's good is their paragraphs once I look at that, I can take that and go forward with next week
Great.
to work on that.
The teacher planned appropriate real-time assessments throughout the lesson. The assessments were specific for the class and the subgroups that were formed. The teacher articulated what she expected to see and hear with her specific assessments, giving her the necessary information to adjust instruction at the subgroup level.